The morning sun was barely peeking through the dark clouds when Sarah Mitchell's phone started buzzing nonstop. As she reached for it, her heart began to race. The weather alerts were getting worse by the minute. Hurricane Elena had changed direction overnight and was now heading straight for the Georgia coast, much earlier than expected. Sarah quickly grabbed her emergency kit and badge. The letters on it spelled out clearly, Southeast Regional Disaster Relief Coordinator, FEMA. At 35, she was one of the youngest people to hold this position, and today would test every bit of her experience. "This is not good," she muttered, looking at the latest satellite images on her tablet. The hurricane had grown stronger, now a Category 4, and thousands of lives were at risk. Sarah knew she needed to get to the Emergency Operations Center immediately. She jumped into her old Ford pickup truck, the one she trusted most during disasters. It wasn't pretty, with its scratched blue paint and muddy tires, but it had never let her down in the field. The truck roared to life as she pulled out of her driveway, her mind already mapping out evacuation routes and emergency shelter locations. The streets of Atlanta were surprisingly empty at 6:30 a.m. Sarah's phone kept buzzing with updates from her team. 3 shelters needed to be set up immediately. The coastal hospitals needed evacuation plans. The National Guard was waiting for her coordination. Every minute counted. She pressed harder on the gas pedal, going 45 in a 30 miles per hour zone. Her truck's tires hummed against the wet pavement as she carefully maneuvered through the streets. The operations center was just 10 minutes away when she saw the flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. "Not now," Sarah whispered, knowing every delayed minute could impact the emergency response. She pulled over immediately, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched the police officer approach in her side mirror. Officer Mike Thompson walked up to her window, his face stern. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, shining his flashlight into the truck. Sarah could feel her phone vibrating again in her pocket. Probably another urgent update from her team. "Officer, I apologize for speeding," Sarah said calmly, reaching for her documents. "But we have a Category 4 hurricane heading our way, and I need to get to the Emergency Operations Center. I'm the Regional Disaster Relief Coordinator." She handed him her license along with her FEMA credentials. Officer Thompson barely glanced at her ID. Instead, he looked at her worn jacket and the old truck with skepticism. "Ma'am, I've heard all kinds of excuses for speeding, but this is a new one," he said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. "Everyone's always in an emergency, aren't they?" Sarah took a deep breath, staying professional despite her frustration. Her phone buzzed again, the 5th time in 3 minutes. The situation was getting worse, and she was stuck here, trying to convince someone who had already judged her based on her appearance. "Officer, you can verify my credentials." "Please call it in," Sarah insisted, her voice steady but urgent. "People's lives depend on the next few hours of preparation." "Right," Officer Thompson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, you can explain all that to the judge. I'm writing you a ticket for going 15 over the limit." He started writing the citation, taking his time despite Sarah's obvious distress. 10 precious minutes later, Sarah held the yellow ticket in her hand, watching Officer Thompson drive away. Her phone showed 8 missed calls and 15 urgent messages. The hurricane had picked up speed, and the evacuation orders needed to be issued immediately. She started her truck again, this time driving exactly at the speed limit despite every instinct telling her to hurry. The ticket wasn't important right now. She had a job to do, lives to save, and a massive storm to prepare for. But a small voice in her head reminded her that this wasn't the first time she'd been judged unfairly, and it probably wouldn't be the last. As she finally pulled into the Emergency Operations Center parking lot, Sarah pushed aside her frustration. She had more important things to focus on. The next 48 hours would be crucial, and she needed to be at her best. The hurricane wasn't going to wait for anyone, and neither was she. 2 weeks after the hurricane, Sarah Mitchell sat on a hard wooden bench in courtroom 302, waiting for her traffic case to be called. The courtroom was packed with people, all facing similar minor violations. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, barely keeping the Georgia heat at bay. Judge Richard Harrison sat high on his bench, his gray hair neatly combed, his black robe pressed and perfect. At 60 years old, he had spent the last 20 years building a reputation as a strict but fair judge. Today, he moved through his cases quickly, showing little patience for excuses or long explanations. Sarah watched as person after person stepped forward. Most of them were nervous, fumbling with their words as they tried to explain their situations. Judge Harrison's responses were always the same, short, stern, and final. His gavel struck with authority after each case, the sound echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Case number 247, the court clerk called out. Sarah Mitchell, speeding violation, 45 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. Sarah stood up, straightening her simple blue blazer. She had come straight from a morning meeting about hurricane recovery efforts, still wearing her work clothes. Her FEMA badge hung around her neck. She hadn't had time to remove it after the meeting. Step forward, Ms. Mitchell, Judge Harrison said, not looking up as he opened her file. He glanced at the police report, then at the photo of her old pickup truck that Officer Thompson had included. His expression changed slightly, his lips tightening into a thin line. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice clear and professional, I want to explain the circumstances of that morning. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Harrison interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes moved from her worn work boots to her practical clothes, then to her face. I see here that you were doing 15 miles over the speed limit at 6:40 in the morning. Officer Thompson notes that you claimed to be some sort of emergency worker. Yes, Your Honor. I'm the Southeast Regional Disaster Relief Coordinator for FEMA. That morning, Hurricane Elena had suddenly changed course. Judge Harrison held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Ms. Mitchell, this court sees many creative excuses for speeding. Claiming to be a FEMA coordinator during a hurricane is certainly original. His tone made it clear he didn't believe her. Sarah felt her chest tighten, but kept her voice steady. Your Honor, you can verify my credentials. I was trying to reach the Emergency Operations Center because... Ms. Mitchell, Judge Harrison interrupted again, his voice growing stern. The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of what story they choose to tell. You were speeding in a residential area, endangering lives. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. She had been rushing to save lives that morning, coordinating evacuations that would move thousands of people to safety. But looking at Judge Harrison's face, she could see he had already made up his mind about her. Do you have anything else to add? He asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't really interested in her answer. Sarah reached into her folder and pulled out her official FEMA identification and a copy of the hurricane report from that morning. Yes, Your Honor. I had documentation of my position and the emergency situation that will be enough, Judge Harrison said firmly. He didn't even glance at the documents she held. This court is not interested in elaborate excuses. The fine for your violation is $450, plus court costs of $125, for a total of $575. You have 30 days to pay. Next case. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sarah stood there for a moment, her documents still in hand, feeling the stares of everyone in the courtroom. She had faced prejudice before, but it never got easier, especially from people in positions of power who refused to even consider the truth. As she walked out of the courtroom, Sarah's phone buzzed. There was another emergency meeting about hurricane recovery efforts. Despite what had just happened, she knew where her focus needed to be. The communities affected by the hurricane needed her help, and she had work to do, whether Judge Harrison believed in her position or not. Sarah walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, her mind already shifting from the unfair fine to more pressing matters. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an urgent alert about another hurricane forming in the Atlantic. Hurricane Frank was gathering strength, and early projections showed it heading straight for the Georgia coast, just like Elena had 2 weeks ago. Inside her old pickup truck, Sarah took a moment to collect herself. The $575 fine would hurt her budget, but it wasn't what bothered her most. It was Judge Harrison's refusal to even look at her credentials, the way he had dismissed her without a second thought. She had faced such treatment before, but it never got easier. Her phone rang, breaking through her thoughts. It was Marcus, her assistant coordinator. Sarah, we got trouble, he said, his voice tense. Hurricane Frank just jumped to Category 3, and it's moving faster than predicted. The governor wants an emergency briefing in 1 hour. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sarah replied, pushing her courthouse experience aside. She had more important things to focus on than one prejudiced judge. Starting her truck, she headed straight for the Emergency Operations Center. The center was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. Dozens of screens showed weather maps, evacuation routes, and emergency resource locations. The room was filled with the sound of phones ringing and people coordinating with various agencies. "Sarah, thank goodness you're here," Marcus said, hurrying over with a stack of papers. FEMA just updated their projections. Frank could be stronger than Elena by the time it hits land. We need to start evacuations earlier this time. Sarah quickly scanned the reports. The situation was serious. "Get me connected with all Coastal County emergency managers," she ordered, moving to her command station. "We need to start preparations now, not later." As she began coordinating with local officials, Sarah's mind was completely focused on the task at hand. This was where she belonged, doing the work she was trained for. Here, no one questioned her authority or doubted her abilities. They only cared about her expertise and experience. The governor's briefing was intense. Sarah presented the evacuation plans with confidence, explaining how they had learned from Hurricane Elena and improved their response strategies. "We need to issue evacuation orders for coastal areas within the next 6 hours, she explained, pointing to the projected path of the hurricane. "Every minute we wait puts more lives at risk." The governor nodded, trusting her judgment. This was the Sarah that her colleagues knew: decisive, competent, and focused on saving lives. Not the woman Judge Harrison had seen in his courtroom, someone he assumed was making up stories to avoid a ticket. As the day progressed, Sarah moved between emergency coordination meetings, phone calls with FEMA officials, and organizing response teams. The operations center grew more crowded as additional emergency personnel arrived. The National Weather Service kept updating their forecasts, each one showing Hurricane Frank growing stronger. Late in the evening, Sarah finally took a short break. She stood by the window, watching as dark clouds gathered in the distance. The first outer bands of the hurricane would reach the coast by morning. Her phone showed several missed calls from her mother, probably worried about the fine from court. "We're getting reports of panic buying at coastal stores," Marcus said, approaching with fresh satellite images. "And the mayor of Brunswick is asking about shelter capacities." Sarah straightened up, pushing thoughts of the morning's court appearance completely aside. The next 48 hours would be crucial. She had a job to do, and she would do it well, regardless of what anyone thought of her. People's lives depended on her decisions, and that was all that mattered. "Tell Brunswick we're opening 3 additional shelters," she said, heading back to her station. "And get me on the phone with the Red Cross coordinator. We need to make sure all evacuation routes are clear before the storm hits." The hurricane was coming, and Sarah Mitchell was ready. Let Judge Harrison think what he wanted. She had more important things to worry about than his prejudices. Judge Richard Harrison sat in his living room, watching the evening news with growing concern. Hurricane Frank's massive form filled the TV screen as the weathermen pointed to its predicted path. The storm had strengthened to a Category 4, and it was heading straight for their area. "All residents in coastal areas and low-lying regions must evacuate immediately," the news anchor announced, her voice grave. Local authorities stressed this is not an optional evacuation. This storm is extremely dangerous. Richard's phone rang. It was his daughter Emily. "Dad, you need to leave now," she said, worry clear in her voice. "They're saying this hurricane could be worse than Elena. Please come stay with us inland." He looked around his beautiful beachfront home, where he'd lived for the past 15 years. The palm trees outside were already bending in the strengthening wind. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "I'll pack some things and head your way." As he packed his suitcase, the TV continued broadcasting emergency updates. Suddenly, a familiar face appeared on the screen. Richard froze, his hand holding a folded shirt midair. There, directing operations at the Emergency Management Center, was Sarah Mitchell, the woman he'd found in his courtroom just hours ago. "Our Regional Disaster Relief Coordinator, Sarah Mitchell, has been working around the clock to ensure public safety," the reporter said. The camera showed Sarah confidently giving orders, coordinating with various emergency teams, and pointing to evacuation maps. Richard sat heavily on his bed, the shirt forgotten in his hands. He watched as Sarah spoke to the camera, her voice carrying the authority he had refused to hear earlier that day. "We've learned from Hurricane Elena. she was saying. We're positioning rescue teams strategically, and we've opened additional shelters inland. But people need to evacuate now. This is not a storm to try to ride out. The sound of breaking glass downstairs snapped Richard out of his daze. A tree branch had smashed through his living room window, and rain was already pouring in. The wind was getting stronger by the minute. He quickly finished packing, grabbed his most important documents, and headed for his car. The streets were filled with people evacuating, creating long lines of slow-moving traffic. Rain hammered against his windshield as police officers directed traffic at major intersections. At one intersection, Richard saw a FEMA truck pull up. To his surprise, Sarah Mitchell stepped out, now wearing a bright yellow emergency response jacket. She was helping an elderly couple whose car had stalled, making sure they got safely into an emergency vehicle. As Richard watched, Sarah worked tirelessly, coordinating with police to clear the intersection, directing emergency vehicles, and helping stranded residents. She was exactly who she had claimed to be in his courtroom, and he had dismissed her without a second thought. The traffic crept forward, and Richard found himself directed to an emergency shelter when his planned route was blocked by flooding. Inside the shelter, he sat on a cot, surrounded by other evacuees. The TV mounted on the wall was still broadcasting emergency updates, and there was Sarah again, now at a different location, organizing shelter operations. "She's been everywhere today," a woman sitting nearby said admiringly. "That FEMA coordinator's really on top of things. My sister's neighborhood was flooding, and she made sure everyone got out safely. Been doing this for years, I heard." Richard felt a deep shame settle in his stomach. He thought about how he had treated her in his courtroom, making assumptions based on her appearance, refusing to even look at her credentials. While he had been passing judgment from his bench, she had been working to save lives, including, quite possibly, his own. The shelter's lights flickered as the hurricane's winds grew stronger outside. Richard watched as more evacuees were brought in, each with their own story of being helped by emergency responders. The very system Sarah Mitchell was coordinating was now providing him shelter from the storm. "We're lucky to have someone like her in charge," another evacuee commented, watching the TV. Richard could only nod silently, the weight of his earlier prejudice pressing heavily on his conscience. The emergency shelter's TV continued to broadcast updates throughout the night. Judge Harrison couldn't sleep, his eyes fixed on the screen every time Sarah Mitchell appeared. As the hours passed, he learned more and more about the woman he had so quickly judged in his courtroom. "We're joined now by Tom Roberts from the National Weather Service," the news anchor announced. "Tom, can you tell us about the coordination with FEMA's Regional Disaster Relief Coordinator, Sarah Mitchell?" "Absolutely," Tom replied. "Sarah's been instrumental in our hurricane response for the past 5 years. She has master's degrees in both emergency management and public policy from Georgia State University. Her work during Hurricane Elena saved countless lives, and she's implementing even better strategies now." Richard sat up straighter on his cot. Master's degrees. He remembered how he had dismissed her worn clothes and old truck as signs of someone making excuses. Now he understood. Those were her work clothes, and that truck was chosen for its reliability in disasters. The shelter's door opened, letting in a gust of wind as more evacuees entered. A young volunteer was explaining to them about Sarah's evacuation plan. "Ms. Mitchell designed these shelter locations herself," she said proudly. "She mapped them based on flood patterns and accessibility. That's why we're all safe here tonight." Richard walked to the shelter's common area, where a group of people were watching another news report. This one showed Sarah's previous emergency responses: floods in Mississippi, tornadoes in Alabama, and 3 other hurricanes before Elena. In each video, she wore the same type of practical clothes he had judged her for in his courtroom. "Did you know she turned down a high-paying corporate job to work in emergency management?" one shelter resident said to another. "My cousin works with her. Says she could be making 3 times as much in the private sector, but she wants to help people instead." The night grew darker as Hurricane Frank's full force hit the coast. The shelter's lights flickered again, but the backup generators kicked in immediately. Richard learned this too was part of Sarah's planning. She had insisted every shelter have multiple power backups and enough supplies for 5 days. Around midnight, the shelter's radio crackled with updates from various emergency teams. Sarah's voice came through clearly, coordinating rescue efforts in flooded areas. "Team Alpha, proceed to Oak Street. Team Biga, I need you at the marina. Check every boat for stranded residents. Richard thought about the $575 fine he had imposed on her. It seemed so small and petty now, watching her coordinate millions of dollars in emergency resources and direct hundreds of emergency workers. He had assumed she was making excuses, when in reality, she had been rushing to set up this very shelter system that was now protecting him and hundreds of others. A small TV crew had set up in the shelter's office area, broadcasting updates. They played a clip from last year when Sarah received an award from the governor for her emergency management work. She stood at the podium in her simple clothes, talking about the importance of preparation and community. The old truck she drives, a shelter worker was telling someone. That's because she needs something reliable in floods. Fancy cars can't handle the conditions she works in. She's taught all of us that in emergency work, practicality beats appearance every time. As morning approached, Richard couldn't help but notice how every emergency worker who came through the shelter knew Sarah by name. They spoke of her with respect and admiration. These people didn't see a woman to be judged by her clothes or vehicle. They saw a leader who had earned their trust through years of dedicated service. The rain hammered against the shelter's roof as Richard sat with his thoughts. In his 20 years on the bench, he had prided himself on being fair and just. But now he had to face an uncomfortable truth. He had let his prejudices blind him to the reality of who Sarah Mitchell really was. The next morning, Hurricane Frank hit with full force. The shelter's sturdy walls trembled against the powerful winds. Judge Harrison stood by a window, watching trees bend almost to the ground. The rain was falling so hard it looked like sheets of water rushing past. Suddenly, the shelter's main doors burst open. Sarah Mitchell walked in, completely soaked despite her yellow emergency gear. Her boots left wet footprints on the floor as she quickly moved to the shelter's command center. She hadn't noticed Judge Harrison standing in the corner. "We've got flooding in the east sector," she announced to her team. "The river's overflowing faster than predicted. We need to evacuate the Silver Creek retirement home immediately." Her voice was firm and clear, the same voice he had interrupted in his courtroom. Judge Harrison watched as she worked. Her movements were quick but careful, her decisions immediate but well thought out. She pointed to a map, directing rescue teams to different locations. Every person in the room listened to her with complete attention and respect. "Ms. Mitchell," a young emergency worker called out. "The retirement home's backup generator has failed. They have 20 residents on oxygen machines." Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her radio. "This is Mitchell. I need 2 emergency power units and medical transport at Silver Creek immediately. And get me the National Guard's helicopter unit on the line." The next few hours were intense. Judge Harrison observed as Sarah coordinated multiple rescue operations at once. She worked nonstop, moving between the radio, phone calls, and rescue teams. She didn't sit down once, didn't even stop for water. "Roads blocked on Pine Street," a rescue worker reported. "Trees down everywhere. Can't get the ambulances through. Use the alternate route we mapped last week," Sarah responded instantly. "Take Marshall Road to Creek Drive. And tell the cleanup crews we need those trees cleared as soon as the winds drop below 40 miles per hour." A loud crash shook the building. Part of a nearby roof had torn off and slammed into the shelter's wall. Several people screamed, but Sarah remained calm. "Everyone moved to the interior rooms," she ordered. "Standard protocol, just like we practiced. Anderson, check the wall for damage." Judge Harrison found himself being guided to a safer area along with other evacuees. From his new position, he could still see Sarah working. She was talking to someone on the phone while simultaneously marking updates on a large wall map. "The hospital's emergency room is overcrowding," she said to her team. "Direct all non-critical cases to the secondary medical station we set up at the community center. And make sure they have enough supplies." Hour after hour, Sarah handled one crisis after another. When the radio reported people stranded on rooftops, she dispatched rescue boats. When a shelter lost power, she immediately redirected generators. When food supplies ran low at one location, she organized an emergency delivery despite the dangerous conditions. The judge watched as she helped an elderly woman who was having a panic attack, speaking to her softly and kindly despite all the chaos around her. Just minutes later, She was back at the command center, coordinating with the Coast Guard for a difficult rescue operation. "Ms. Mitchell," someone called out. "The mayor's on the line. He's asking about casualties." Sarah took the phone, her face showing both exhaustion and determination. "Sir, we've had no loss of life so far," she reported. 17 injuries, but nothing critical. The evacuation plans worked. We got most people out before the worst hit." Judge Harrison sank into a chair, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. The woman he had fined and dismissed without a second thought was saving lives, managing a crisis, and keeping an entire region safe. Her worn clothes were a uniform of service. Her old truck was a tool for saving lives. And here he was, sitting safely in a shelter she had prepared, protected by plans she had made. 3 days after Hurricane Frank hit, the sun finally broke through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a changed landscape and a changed judge. Judge Richard Harrison stood outside the Emergency Operations Center, gathering his courage to do something he had rarely done in his 20 years on the bench: admit he was wrong. Inside the building, emergency teams were still hard at work. The walls were covered with maps showing flood zones, power outages, and rescue operations. Tired workers moved back and forth, carrying reports and coordinating recovery efforts. In the middle of it all was Sarah Mitchell, still wearing the same type of practical clothes he had judged her for in his courtroom. "The West Side needs more drinking water," Sarah was saying to her team. "And make sure the medical supplies reach the Pine Grove shelter by noon." She looked exhausted but focused, running on what must have been very little sleep. Judge Harrison waited quietly, watching her work. She moved with purpose between different groups, checking reports, making decisions, and encouraging her tired team. Every person she spoke to showed her the same respect, the respect he had failed to give her. Finally, there was a brief pause in the activity. Sarah was standing alone at a map, marking something with a red pen. Judge Harrison approached slowly, his heart beating faster with each step. "Ms. Mitchell," he said softly. Sarah turned around. For a moment, surprise flashed across her face as she recognized him. Then her expression became neutral, professional. "Judge Harrison," she replied, "if you're looking for shelter information, the community center on Maple Street is still open." "No, that's not why I'm here," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I came to apologize." Sarah stayed quiet, watching him. Around them, the emergency center continued its busy work, but in that moment, it felt like they were in their own bubble of silence. "I was wrong," Judge Harrison continued. "Completely and utterly wrong. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I looked at your clothes and your truck and made assumptions that were not only incorrect but shamefully unfair." He gestured at the busy emergency center around them. "You were rushing to save lives that morning, and I treated you like someone making excuses. I didn't even look at your credentials. I was—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was everything a judge shouldn't be." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but she remained professional. "Your Honor, I appreciate your apology, but I'm very busy right now. We still have thousands of people needing help." "I know," he replied quickly. "I've seen your work firsthand. I was in one of your shelters during the hurricane. I watched you coordinate rescues, manage emergencies, save lives. The fine I gave you, it was wrong. I'll make sure it's canceled immediately." "The fine isn't important," Sarah said, turning back to her map. "What's important is learning from mistakes. I hope this experience helps you see people more clearly in your courtroom, Judge Harrison. Not everyone who appears before you is who you assume they are at first glance." Judge Harrison nodded sullenly. "You've taught me that lesson better than anyone ever has, Ms. Mitchell. And I want you to know that I'm going to make changes in how I handle cases. Real changes." For the first time, Sarah turned to fully face him. "That would be more meaningful than any apology, Your Honor. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. We're expecting more storms this season, and I need to make sure we're prepared." As Judge Harrison walked out of the Emergency Operations Center, he felt both humbled and determined. Behind him, he could hear Sarah's voice resuming her duties, directing her team with the authority he had refused to see just days ago. The sun was bright overhead, but the judge's mind was on the darkness of his own prejudices and the light that had finally broken through. He had work to do too, making sure that what happened in his courtroom that day would never happen again. 6 months after Hurricane Frank, Judge Richard Harrison's courtroom was a different place. Gone was the quick judgment and stern dismissals. Instead, he listened more carefully to each person who stood before him, remembering the lesson Sarah Mitchell had taught him. On this particular morning, a young man in work boots and dusty clothes stood before the bench. "Your Honor," the man said nervously, "I was speeding because there was an emergency at the construction site. A wall was about to collapse." In the past, Judge Harrison might have dismissed this as another excuse, but now he looked at the man carefully. "Do you have any documentation of this emergency?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The man pulled out some papers from his worn jacket. "Yes, sir. Here's the incident report and my supervisor's statement." Judge Harrison took time to read the documents thoroughly. He thought about Sarah, about how he had refused to even look at her credentials. "Thank you for providing this evidence," he said. "Case dismissed." Later that day, Sarah Mitchell visited the courthouse. She wasn't there for a case. She had been invited to speak at a special training session for judges and court officials. Judge Harrison sat in the back of the room, listening as she explained how emergency responders worked and why they sometimes had to bend normal rules during crisis. "Sometimes, people who appear in your courtrooms may not look like what you expect," Sarah told the gathered officials. "The person in muddy boots might be a rescue worker. The woman in worn clothes might be a disaster coordinator. The old truck might be chosen for its reliability in floods." The judges in the room nodded, taking notes. Judge Harrison had helped organize this training, part of his new initiative to combat prejudice in the court system. He had also started a program to provide legal aid to disaster victims, remembering how many people he had met in the shelter during Hurricane Frank. After the training, Sarah approached him. She looked different in her formal presentation clothes, but she carried herself with the same quiet confidence he had seen in the Emergency Operations Center. "You've made real changes here," she said, looking around the courthouse. "My team says they've noticed a difference in how emergency workers are treated in court." Judge Harrison smiled softly. "It's the least I could do. That day in my courtroom, it opened my eyes to how many other people I might have judged unfairly over the years." "Change isn't easy," Sarah replied, "but it's necessary. Speaking of which, we're implementing new emergency protocols for the upcoming storm season. Would you be willing to help us coordinate with the legal system?" "Of course," he answered immediately. "Whatever you need." Over the next few months, Judge Harrison worked closely with Sarah's team to improve emergency response procedures. He helped create new guidelines for handling cases involving emergency workers and established a special court session for dealing with disaster-related issues. His fellow judges noticed the change in him. The harsh, quick-to-judge Harrison was gone. In his place was a more thoughtful, careful man who looked beyond appearances to see the whole story. 1 year after Hurricane Frank, Judge Harrison sat in his office, looking at a framed photo on his wall. It showed him with Sarah and her team at the opening of a new emergency response center. Below it was a simple quote, "Justice sees with the heart, not just the eyes." His phone rang. It was Sarah. Another storm was approaching the coast. "We're activating the emergency protocols," she said. "Will the courts be ready?" "We'll be ready," he assured her. "The legal aid team is on standby, and all judges have been briefed on emergency procedures." He paused, then added, "Thank you, Sarah. Not just for your service, but for teaching me one of the most important lessons of my career." "We all learn and grow, Judge Harrison," she replied. "That's what makes us better at serving others." As he hung up the phone, Judge Harrison looked out his window at the clear sky, knowing that when the next storm came, he would face it as a changed man, one who had learned to look past appearances and see the truth in every person who stood before him.